I've been reading a lot about the Puritans again. They keep drawing me back to them. And David Hall, who's a wonderful writer on that period of American history, just put out a big, thick tome, which I have acquired. Anyway, way back in the Puritan era, the congregations that became Unitarian, the men who wanted to be members of the church, and it was men who were allowed to be members in that generation, women were not allowed to be, but those who wanted to achieve membership in the church were required to give a testimony of their godliness, essentially, their evidence of a godly life. The Puritans didn't want their churches to be a casual thing. They didn't want the church to be something that you did just out of habit, and they thought that the idea that you would attend a church because you happen to live in the parish was a very corrupt idea. They were idealistic, and they took spiritual growth and moral examination extremely seriously. But of course, as with all very idealistic movements, what happened eventually is that these communities got into a lot of navel-gazing, right? Because you're constantly thinking about, who's righteous and who's not, and you get into these very time-consuming, involved conversation about who should be in and who should be out, and suddenly you're not just looking at your own sins, you're terribly interested in everybody else's sins and what's going on with them, and it gets very schismatic. It also creates some really juicy soap opera kind of dynamics. And if you're thinking, well, those silly Puritans, we're not beyond that today, don't get me wrong. All communities and certainly churches still spend a lot of time in their meetings deciding on parameters for participation. What kind of people should or could we be attracting is how we tend to think of it these days. And we still have to think a lot about how we define membership. What does belonging mean? And this past week or 2 weeks ago, the staff and I talked to various leaders and lay people in the congregation because we do what we call scrubbing the rolls, which is that we look at the membership rolls. Who's on the membership list? Have we seen them for a long time? Are they in any way engaged with the community? And have we heard from them? How are they doing? Have they moved, etc.? Have they made a financial contribution and said, I'm not around, but I want you to have, this is for my UUA dues. Some people may not know this. We, as a congregation, pay the Unitarian Universalist Association a certain amount of money for each person that we have listed in our membership rolls. So our expectations of membership are on paper very minimal. But of course our hope is that people will be engaged in a very deep way. So it's very hard for me to imagine having this kind of mentality where someone who comes to the door of the church and says, I'd like to be part of this, that you would say, well, that's fine. The council will be meeting on Monday night, and you should present yourself with a compelling testimony as to why we should accept you among us. The Puritans wanted to gather churches of what they called the visible saints. But I would personally rather be with the visible sinners. And I mean that. It's hugely gratifying to be in relationship with people who come in thinking they know why they've come through the doors of the church. Often it's Sunday school for the children, or I really want just a peaceful opportunity to listen to some beautiful music on Sunday morning and maybe hear a message that might get me thinking. Maybe I'm coming in because I want to connect with some social justice and service projects. But those people discover along the way that there's more to it than what the things I had on my list to accomplish by being part of a church. What do you know? I'm starting to acknowledge the reality of my spirit and my soul on a more regular basis. And it's changing me. So say that instead of eroding and evolving over the decades and the centuries, that tradition of requiring potential church members to give a confession of faith, make a confession of faith, and present evidence of God's saving grace in their lives. Imagine if that was still intact in some way. If you were asked, come into the see the council and make a compelling testimony as to why we should let you in. What would you say? What would be your compelling testimony? When I first thought of that question for myself, I was really defensive. I was like, who's anybody to ask me that? We're all flawed human beings, and it's none of your business. But after a while, trying to think of it as the Puritans might have thought about it, I came to see that question as more of an invitation to really think about how you're doing spiritually and who are you? What are you bringing? Not as an insult, but just to, again, provide an opportunity to talk about something with a group of people who care deeply about those matters, to talk about those matters that we don't talk about really anywhere else in our lives. We don't talk about our spiritual well-being around the water cooler at work. Some people might, but I think in this cultural context where we are, it doesn't happen. In the ministerial formation process, for those who seek to be ordained, those who feel called to ministry do have to make that account for themselves, if you will, to various credentialing bodies in the Unitarian Universalist Association, and with congregations that train and mentor them, us. And we make that accounting also with ourselves and with our peers through seminary and divinity school, classwork, and all those long conversations that happen outside of the classroom. And it's a very intense and revealing process. And I don't think it's a funny haha joke, but the joke when I was in divinity school was that our sister campus was McLean Psychiatric Hospital. Because in this process, you become acquainted with your demons, as well as with some of your strengths and gifts. And sometimes it does happen, you may be rejected at any point along the process and have your calling be not validated by the community. You're very vulnerable, and that's humbling, but it's also a time of profound spiritual growth if you allow it to be and don't enter into it with total fear and resistance, and don't hold on too tightly to preconceived notions of self, and hold on too tightly to assumptions about what others see in you. It was very painful at times, but it was a gift because people are also paying close attention to you, and they're giving you honest feedback and holding you accountable for some of your nonsense. I remember one committee saying to me, so how are we to know that this isn't just you, the actress, playing another role? And I was like, it's not, but what a scary thought that somebody might see that. So nowadays, church membership is an entirely flipped proposition from that Puritan approach, because now the church says to the newcomer, to the visitor, please like us. We hope you find us worthy. And once you get involved in a UU congregation, we emphasize the belovedness and worthiness of all, which is enshrined in our first principle that says we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of all people. And there you are, and there we all are, believing in that goodness and the potential of each human being, and also proclaiming that God, beyond our imagining and naming, that great and creative force, has love at its center. A love also beyond our imagining, but glimpsed and intuited in our own experiences of love. So I don't know exactly how the approach to church involvement and membership evolved over the centuries from prove you're worthy, to we hope you find us attractive. But it definitely was informed and shaped by consumerism and capitalism. Churches are now just one option for how people can spend their time. And so they have become a kind of product, marketing themselves to shoppers. I cringe, therefore, when I hear when we use language of advertising for our programs. I hope that I always try to say, catch myself in doing that and say, can we use the language of outreach? Let's create outreach materials or invitations to the community to join together for experiences and programming. However we get here, though, with whatever attitude, if we engage at all with the church, we will begin to learn about ourselves through the spiritual practice of being in community. It's an irresistible force. As social justice organizer Mickey Scott B. Jones says, relationship is the sandpaper that wears away the resistance to change. Which is to say that perhaps we do not always consciously recognize that we need to change, that we are clay pots in need of smoothing and beautifying, but indeed we are. And indeed, transformation is the only way we can grow into harmony with the divine. Yes, we are born with inherent worth and dignity. We are born, cherished, and beloved by creation. But if we are to grow into harmony with the divine, that's our process and our work. It doesn't happen by saying it. It doesn't happen just by being born beloved. It happens through the willingness to be shaped, to be forged in the fire of community. There's a story, a wonderful story about this, told by our great theologian James Luther Adams. It's a story that he told from his time in a Chicago Unitarian Universalist congregation. They were at a board meeting, and there was one board member who complained frequently that the minister was preaching too much on race relations. And this was during the height of the Civil Rights era, and this person wasn't against, addressing the topic, but his argument was, we have to be realistic, and we have to just remember what human beings are really like, and that kind of thing. And the other members of the board challenged him. And they said, what do you think the purpose of the church really is? And the man said, look, I'm not a theologian. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. And the other board members continued to press him. And they said, no, you can't just, excuse yourself because you're not a theologian. You're an important leader in this congregation. You're making decisions on behalf of this church. So you need to know what you think the meaning and the purpose of this place is. So at about 1 o'clock in the morning, now one of our board meetings would never go that late. This was a time of great roiling unrest and conversations like this. So at 1 in the morning, this man finally says, I guess the purpose of the church is to get a hold of people like me and change them. The beautiful thing about that story is that if you get involved and stay involved and committed to congregational life for long enough, you will eventually play all the roles in that human drama. You will be the preacher on an issue that has hold on your conscience, and you can preach with your lives. Preaching doesn't just happen from a pulpit. You will be the church members, asking each other, what's important here? Who are we? What's our purpose? And we will also all be that person realizing, whoa, I guess what's important for me to understand is that it's not always someone else who needs to change and grow. It's me. Before I became a minister, I was a high school English teacher. The big difference between teaching in school and being a minister is that when you're a teacher, Your students graduate, and they leave. You give them what you have to give. You work hard with them. You all learn from each other, and then they go off to their next stage in life. But in ministry, there's no way for us to assess our learning, really. No tests, no formal tests for any of us. And that's why it's so important that we build reflection into the life of our community, so that we don't go on for years doing the same thing, thinking the same thoughts, becoming too staid, too set in our ways and our roles and our self-understanding, and assuming that we know all that there is to know and all that we're going to ever know. We have to kind of set our own exams, and each of us individually should also do that regularly, that examine. Do I understand my role in this community? Do I understand the purpose of the church and how I am living into its mission and ministry myself? But this is why it takes, if you're wondering why churches take so long to get anything done, it's because the process and the relationships are every bit as important as the outcomes and the actions. We have to engage in discernment. We have to have time to process and check in on what we're doing. This week, in the last couple of weeks, in terms of our sanctuary project, some of the leaders and I have gone to the police chief, to the fire chief, to the Board of Selectmen chair, to build relationships. So it's not just within the congregation, it's within the community, because that matters just as much as the outcome. We have to think about what we're learning, how we're changing, how we feel called to grow, what we have done to get there, and how we want to move forward to keep progressing in wisdom as we do the next thing. All are worthy to be there, all are welcome, all are needed, and all are growing. And what is our graduation? Some may say it is at the end of life when we breathe our last, and it may be said of us, "Well done, good and faithful servant." But I hold with hope and curiosity the idea that perhaps when we are done with our life's work, the soul continues its progress. As 19th century Unitarian minister said, James Freeman Clarke said, "In the continuity of human development in all worlds." When we are graduated from this school of learning that is life, perhaps we do join the saints gone before us to become one great cosmic force for progress, for wisdom. Perhaps we become part of a coaching and mentoring squad in spirit for those still in the classroom of human experience. Perhaps that is what it means to be a good ancestor, to have worked hard to learn and grow our minds and souls while we lived, to have earned a place in the afterlife as part of the magnificent force that encourages, supports, and sustains all souls as they grow into harmony with the divine. So may we live to make it so. Amen.